Hey everyone. So I just want to start off by saying that this is my first video guide on this channel, and it's also the first time that I upload a video where I'm actually speaking. All my previous uploads have just been gameplay footage, so if this is something you like and would like to see more of in the future, please let me know. I also just want to say thank you to everybody who has interacted with me on this channel as well as Reddit over the last 6 months of starting my Diablo 4 journey. We were able to achieve rank 1 in the Max Roll Avatar of Zero leaderboard event, and it was definitely not an individual effort. Much of the theory crafting and gameplay and playstyle of the build I used and the run itself came from influence that I had from other content creators in the community. So to everybody involved, I just want to say thank you. And without further ado, let's get into it. Please try to keep in mind that I actually don't have a script. I'm going to be recording this and talking over it live. And that's something that I hope to work on in the future, but currently my time is limited. I just wanted to get this out. Thank you. So I'm starting from the beginning, showing myself popping the glyph, just so that there's no confusion that this was a cherry-picked run or footage from a run. And I'm not warmed up. This is the first dungeon I'm going to be running today, so excuse any sloppy gameplay. This is a tier 100, and you can hopefully tell already just how hard this hits.
I'm not ready.
The survival is good. I can always go into
ready.
blood mist if I need to. So I can Bludstorm for anything bad. Potion. Yeah, I'm gonna Bludstorm back, so back to being essentially invincible. See, there we had an 18 mil hit. Most of the time without any setup, between 1 to 4 mil. Overpower crits. Just walking around. I'm doing a pretty poor job of keeping up my story right now, so just to give it all. Even so, the healing from Blood Surge and the overall tankiness of this build, they do just although I will expect that that'll be far more punishing if Gauntlet turns out to be harder content. And this is my favorite part, where I can just essentially sit here and spam Blood Surge. I'm just getting this started, that's right, stay in one spot. So I'm going to cut this off here and get into the build. So real quick before we get into the build itself, I decided I just wanted to also show what this looks like on single target, but I'm out of Duriel mounts, unfortunately, so I'm just going to be able to show it on Varshan, and I'm going to go into Blood Mist before we start, but I actually am not currently wearing Tybalt's Will. I'm just going into Blood Mist to activate Flesh Eater. So I'm going to start by going through the skill tree, and I've taken all my gear off so that I'm not wearing anything that's going to affect the levels of these skills. So this is what your skill tree should look like when you put this up if you're not wearing anything. So to begin, I have 1 point into Hemorrhage and 1 point into Enhanced Hemorrhage, and these points are just used to access the rest of the skill tree. We don't actually use a basic ability. I have 5 points into Blood Surge, 1 point into Enhanced Blood Surge, and 1 point into Paranormal Blood Surge. Now, I'm still not sure overall if going into Unliving Energy and then Imperfectly Balanced would be a net positive for this build. However, I've elected not to do that here just because it increases the essence cost of our Blood Surge. And I found that it's more helpful to be able to cycle through Blood Surge casts as quickly as possible in order to have more frequent overpowers. With Imperfectly Balanced, sometimes we run into some more essence issues. So that could be something that changes in the future, but I just thought I would mention it here. We have 3 points into Hewed Flesh, and this is to enable our ability to generate corpses on single target bosses. We have 1 point into Blood Mist, 1 point into Enhanced Blood Mist, and this is going to reduce our cooldown every time we cast something that overpowers to enable us to go into Blood Mist as much as we need. And then I have 1 point into Ghastly Blood Mist. You could just as well put 1 point into Dreadful Blood Mist, and that's something that I've done in the past, as it works pretty well with the gameplay and gives us 10% critical strike chance as of Season 3. But I generally go for Ghastly Blood Mist, and the reason is because when setting up for a single target boss or individual packs, I find it's very helpful to be able to go into Blood Mist and reliably generate at least 1 corpse to proc a corpse tendrils, or potentially up to 3 corpses to activate our Flesh Eater Paragon node. I don't put any points into Corpse Explosion, even though you'll see Corpse Explosion on the bar, and that's because we don't really want to scale it up. We're just using Corpse Explosion as a means for corpse consumption. And with a Shaco or a Ring of the Sacrilegious, both of these provide ranks to corpse skills, so you don't actually need to put any points here at all. If you don't have either of those items, you could take a point from Grim Harvest, for instance, and just put it in the ability itself so that you can add it to your bars. I have 3 out of 3 in Grim Harvest, and this is just to increase our ability to generate essence. And I have 3 points in Fueled by Death. This is one of the multipliers that we get from consuming corpses, and the other one we get is from our Flesh Eater Legendary Paragon node. I have 3 points into Death's Embrace, 3 into Death's Reach, and 3 into Amplify Damage. These are all multiplicative benefits. And I have 3 points into Decrepify. We don't really make a ton of use of the Decrepify Lucky Hit proc, but it does help. And I've noticed that the Lucky Hit stun chance also seems to be pretty helpful in terms of increasing our survivability, activating our control glyph, multipliers, things of that nature. I have 3 points into Gruesome Mending. This is mostly to help activate our key passive, which is based on Blood Orb healing, but also just help with overall survivability. I have 3 points into Coalesce Blood, 3 into Tides of Blood, and 3 into Drain Vitality, as this is our primary source of generating Fortify. In this version of the build, I think it's actually the only source of generating Fortify, so this is pretty important. Now, I mentioned with Corpse Explosion that you don't actually need to put any ranks in the ability to have it on your bars, and we could potentially do the same thing with Corpse Tendrils here. We could remove all 3 of these points and it would still function pretty well, but I put these points into Corpse Tendrils, one for the slow that Corpse Tendrils gets prior to things being stunned, as that will activate the 10% multiplier on our control glyph, and then we get a 20% when they're actually stunned. but also due to Blighted Corpse Tendrils, which has a 35% chance of spawning blood orbs when damaging enemies. This is pretty helpful in a blood build. I have 3 points into standalone, as we don't use minions, and so this is just an 18% damage reduction. And then I have 3 points into Memento Mori, which, since we're sacrificing our minions, is going to increase their sacrifice bonuses. 1 point into Bone Storm, Prime Bone Storm, and Supreme Bone Storm, and then we select the Rathma's Vigor key passive. And that's just about it for our skill tree. Okay, so starting off by taking a look at the Paragon board, I just want to say that the board is relatively inflexible in the sense that there's not too many places where you can move points around, but it's designed in a way that we're able to hit 70% in all resistances with the right gear on, as well as at least 9200 armor, which is the cap versus level 100 enemies. One place that you actually can potentially move points around would be for this armor node here. I can do this and move it to the other side for 5% damage, but in a blood build, you typically stack a lot of overpower damage. You'll see when we get to the character sheet that we have over 3000 overpower damage, and all of that goes into the additive damage category, where this 5% really isn't going to make a difference. Another spot is further down in the Paragon board. You could take this point out of the magic node, granting extra armor, and move it down to this magic node for max life. But outside of these two options, there really isn't a lot of wiggle room in terms of moving things around on the Paragon board. I would recommend that you adjust your build as needed while leveling and gearing so that you're able to hit 70% in all resistances, as this is pretty critical to our overall survivability. So to start off, this is the layout of the first board, and we have the sacrificial glyph. Not too much to talk about here. Moving on down. One change you could potentially make is moving this willpower node over to this intelligence node, as intelligence is preferred to willpower in general. However, I have it set up this way in order to reach the 530 breakpoint on a later board where we receive another 5% blood orb healing, as I think I value that a little bit over just an extra 5 intelligence. So you'll notice I've skipped the targeted node, which gives extra elite damage, as again, this is all just additive damage, and that's going to go into the same category as our overpower damage, critical strike damage, all other additive damage. And so even though this is a 30%, it's still basically going to be less than 1% over our total additive damage. I have corporeal on this board, and that's to gain the benefit from this resistance node, which helps to allow us to reach 70% in all resistances. And then we have Flesh Eater, which gives us a 40% multiplier after consuming 5 corpses. Moving over here, we have our Bloodbath board. And on this board, I have the Essence Glyph. And while you're leveling up, if you don't have all your points where you can just go through and plug these in, I would actually recommend going through and getting the rest of these dexterity nodes, as that's going to massively increase your critical strike damage. Again, critical strike damage is an additive stat, so once you have the rest of these multipliers, not maximizing the essence node really isn't going to decrease your overall damage output that much, as I believe this only increases to about 177 or 176 critical strike damage. That's about 70% additive damage, which isn't nothing, but again, that's going into a category that on an overpower build we already have a ton of. So following the Paragon board, it looks like this is the next board that we go to, but based on the bonus here, you can see that I actually slotted this in second to last, and the reason is because the bonus benefits that we want are more important on other boards. So after Bloodbath, I stopped about here, and then I went over and started on this Paragon board, which is Blood Begets Blood. And one of the main reasons is because of the Aggression Paragon node, which gives us another 45% overpower damage. And again, this is just additive damage at this point, but of the things that are available, this is one of the ones worth taking advantage of. And then with 530 willpower, which you should hit with this setup, you'll get an extra 5% blood orb healing, which, again, not super valuable, but it helps, as with our key passive for Rathma's Vigor. Wow, that was a tongue twister. We're able to generate more overpowers by the amount of blood orb healing that we receive. And then going down into this board, which is Bone Graft, we're just following this pathing in order to activate our glyph. Oh, I'm sorry. Also, this is the dominate glyph on the Blood Begets Blood board. And we do actually take all the willpower available in order to maximize this glyph. And that's the only glyph that we're going to do that for in this build. And it's because it's such a massive bonus for each 5 willpower that you get. Each of these 5 willpower is worth 40% overpower damage, which gets multiplied by our sacrifice bonuses and our Memento Mori passive. So it is worth trying to maximize this glyph. Moving down further, we have our control glyph. And again, this is giving us 80% damage to crowd-controlled enemies, but this is just additive damage, and it's only versus crowd-controlled enemies. So this isn't really going to affect our damage versus bosses, elites that have become unstoppable. And so in general, we don't like additive damage that much, but we especially don't like it here. We're just going to take the 40 intelligence that we need in order to maximize this glyph. And we have the erudite rare node here. This is the last rare node that we're looking to receive the bonus from. And so we put it early on so that our willpower requirements are low for this board. And I don't actually know how I ended up with 440 willpower here and then 530 willpower on this board. At some point I was taking nodes out or taking boards out and putting boards back in, and I must have put them in such an order that this was possible, but I'm not actually sure how I did that. So if someone can figure that out and let me know in the comments, that would be great. One potential swap that you can make while trying to hit 70% in all of your resistance stats is you could potentially actually swap Sacrificial with Control, as they both only require 40 intelligence, and that would give you a multiplier to the resistance node the same way that we have it with Corporeal on this board. So next, after filling out our Bone Graft board, we would come over and put in the points for our Scent of Death board. And this is just a path purely to activate our Amplify glyph, which is going to give us some more armor from this. Another option, that I should mention, is you could actually just move the Amplify glyph over to where Control is and switch those two. That would be a better option versus using the Sacrificial node. I should have mentioned that before. Apologies. But again, this pathing is purely to activate this glyph for the 10% multiplier and the legendary node for Scent of Death. And then the last board that we're going to put in is purely to make use of the exploit glyph. Again, the 42% additive damage for vulnerable, we don't really care too much about. We're just looking to get the 10% multiplier on the bottom of this glyph. And that's it for the Paragon board. So before we get into gear options, I realized I wanted to real quick go through the Book of the Dead and Seneschal construct. So for sacrifices, we're going to sacrifice skeletal warriors and skirmishers, and that's going to give us an increase of 5% critical strike chance, and that's actually slightly more than 5% because we're getting the bonus from our Memento Mori passive on the skill tree. And for mages, we're going to be sacrificing Bone for an increased overpower damage of 25%, and that is multiplicative. And with golems, we're going to be sacrificing the Iron Golem for 30% multiplicative increased critical strike damage. For our Seneschal construct, we're going to be using Tempest because it's the fastest casting ability for governing stones that the Seneschal construct has. We're going to be using resource support, and that combined with the fast attack speed of Tempest is going to allow us to regenerate essence fairly quickly. We're going to be using breaking support, as this is our only source of vulnerable. And you'll see from the gameplay footage that we don't really actually need to make things vulnerable in order to kill them in current content. However, this is something that I might adjust in the future depending on the difficulty level of Gauntlet. And one thing that I'm considering is switching off of Blighted Corpse Tendrils in order to allow our Corpse Tendrils to make things vulnerable. Another option is potentially changing this Governing Stone to something like Pummel, which would provide an AoE option for our Seneschal construct to apply vulnerability. The other effect of this tuning stone for the Seneschal construct is that it removes enemy barrier effects, and this is particularly useful when fighting the Butcher. And then we have Evernight, which allows us to get +4 skills for 2 seconds when the ability is used, and that lasts for 2 seconds. And with the attack speed of Tempest, we're hitting more often than once per second. So Evernight should always be active if we put it on Tempest, as long as we're attacking enemies. On the other side, I'm using Flash of Adrenaline, which gives us a 50% multiplier due to the 150% effective Genesis multiplying it. And that's going to last for 12 seconds because I also have the duration tuning stone active. And then its cooldown is going to be 12 seconds because I use the tactical support tuning stone. And so this really just turns into a 50% multiplier that's always active as long as we're fighting. It's pretty good. One thing that you could do if you're struggling with survivability at all is you could actually just take this out and use something like Reconstruct or Protect. And these are good defensive options, but a 50% multiplier is pretty valuable, and we don't really have a lot of other places to get that, so Flash of Adrenaline typically is the best choice here. I just want to say briefly, though, that if you do swap that for Reconstruct, you should actually remove the duration support, as duration support will increase the length of time that Reconstruct is healing you. However, it actually just means that Reconstruct is healing you less per second. It doesn't increase the healing of Reconstruct, it just makes it heal over a longer period of time. So moving into the last section of this guide, we're going to be looking briefly at our character sheet and then going through the different gear options. So you can see that we did hit 70% in all of our resistances, and this is actually a total of 120%, but due to being in World Tier 4, it's going to be 120% minus 50%, so we hit 70%, which is the cap for resistances. I just wanted to explain how that works real quick. And if we look at our offensive stats, you can see that we're just under 50% for critical strike chance, as I have slightly less than perfect of a roll on my gloves. But with the grasping veins aspect, we're going to be getting 20% critical strike chance, so that's going to bring that to about 70%. And then we also have a 20% increase of critical strike chance while Bone Storm is active. So in total, we're going to have about a 90% critical strike chance. Now, if we look back at the skill tree, that's why I briefly mentioned that our Blood Mist, we're using Ghastly Blood Mist, but we could actually transition over to Dreadful Blood Mist, and that would bring us up to 100% critical strike chance. And that's something that you can play around with and decide which you like better. But I personally value the Corpse Generation enough that I'm willing to go 10% under the critical strike chance cap. So we have 396%, so about 400% critical strike damage. And we have 3100 overpower damage. And again, this is all additive damage after the base inherent to our character, which is 50%. So really, in the additive damage bucket, we have thousands of percent in this build. Probably, I think if we were to add all these up, we'd get a number probably pretty close to 4,000, maybe 3,600, something like that. And you can see why adding a bunch of multipliers from our Paragon board in our gear is going to greatly benefit our overall damage output. And the rest of these are just additive damage that we got from our Paragon board, a little bit from gear as well. So I do use Shaco or Harlequin Crest, in this build, but it is not required. I do think it's the best option, as basically all of these stats synergize well. All stats, the max life, resource generation, and cooldown reduction are all something we value. However, you could potentially use a rare helm with an aspect put on it, and I would try to go for these same stats, all stats, max life, cooldown reduction. You can't actually roll resource generation on a rare helm outside of Shaco. It's the only helm in the game that features that as a substat. So in its place, I would recommend something like % armor, or you could even potentially go with lucky hit with barrier just to allow us to proc our lidless wall more often, something like that. Moving on down, we have basically just a full damage reduction chest piece. So I go with % armor, damage reduction from close, and damage reduction from distant. If anything, I would recommend potentially replacing the damage reduction from distant enemies with a max life roll. However, I haven't been lucky enough to find one of those yet. And I do actually think that there's a good amount of value that you get from having at least one roll of damage reduction from distant, you'll notice that I believe the way MBB put this is it reverse multiplicative, but that's the way that damage reduction stats operate. So the more that you have on, the less effective they actually become. So just having one damage reduction from distant roll is something that I value, but I know a lot of other content creators and build theory crafters have put out builds that don't feature any at all, and I think that's probably fine too. There aren't really many other options for chests, and this is also the only slot that we have available to put our shielding storm aspect on, which is a massive increase to survivability. So I would say definitely just go with a rare chest with as many damage reduction stats as you can and use the shielding storm aspect for this slot. Similarly, for gloves, you really just want to use a pair of rare gloves with grasping veins on it, as that's the best aspect that we have available in terms of things that we're not already using on this build. And what's most important here are the critical strike chance and the ranks to blood surge, as that's going to greatly increase our damage output. I like having attack speed, as the game just feels better to play when you have attack speed, but you can also think about it like if I were to add 100% attack speed to my build, I would get twice as many casts out. That's kind of similar in a way to just adding 100% damage to a single cast. If I cast the same ability twice, I'm going to theoretically do as much damage as if I did cast it at once with 100% extra multiplier on it. However, that does change slightly in terms of blood surge, because blood surge is one of the abilities that cycles through every 5 to 6. I can't remember if it's 5 or 6. I think it's every 5 casts. You're guaranteed. Yeah, when you have 5 stacks of overwhelming blood, your next blood surge overpowers. So what I was saying just before about attack speed isn't exactly accurate. However, that's another reason why I'm in favor of attack speed in general. And then I have 15.9% lucky hit chance on these. Gloves are the slot with the largest substat roll for lucky hit chance we have available, and blood surge has a relatively low lucky hit chance. We're not really using a lot of things for lucky hit. However, we are using it with our Hued Flesh passive from the skill tree that allows us to generate corpses while fighting bosses, for instance, where otherwise we wouldn't be able to generate corpses. However, I'm also using Lidless Wall, which features a chance to restore a primary resource. And so those are two things that I like to take advantage of from lucky hit. And since gloves is the best place to get it, I go for lucky hit on gloves. Other options here, though, instead of lucky hit would be intelligence, all stats, or overpower damage. Again, overpower damage on gloves is just an additive substat. It is going to get multiplied, and I believe having overpower damage on gloves would bring my overall value to about 3,300. So if you're going to take overpower damage on a piece of gear, gloves isn't a bad choice. But again, I just personally lean more towards the lucky hit chance. So for pants, I'm using Blood Moon Breaches, and I'm actually using a roll that I just found in a Nightmare Dungeon. You could very easily obtain a 925 either from Nightmare Dungeons or from Duriel, as Duriel has Blood Moon Breaches in its loot table. But since I'm already above the 9,200 armor cap, I just went with the best roll I could find, and so far for me, I haven't been lucky in finding a good roll from Duriel, but I was able to find it in a tier 100 vault, so I'm going with an 824, although I'm hoping to replace it with a 925. And you can actually potentially swap out Blood Moon Breaches for two other options that I would recommend. One of them is Tybalt's Wool. So I'm going to run over and grab Tybalt's from my stash so you can see what I'm talking about. I'm also going to grab the other thing I would potentially recommend. So with Tybalt's Will, we have a lower multiplier, and we're also losing our stacks to the amplified damage passive. So overall, the damage output from Tybalt's Will is going to be less than Blood Moon Breaches. However, with Tybalt's Will, you also gain 50 primary resource when you become unstoppable. So this means every time we go into Blood Mist, which activates our unstoppable, we're going to gain 50 primary resource. So one thing I like to do sometimes when I'm playing is put on Tybalt's Will and switch over to Dreadful Blood Mist. That's going to give me 100% critical strike chance in a while fighting enemies from grasping veins and from having Bone Storm active. And then every time I go into Blood Mist, I'm gaining 50 primary resource. So I can cast a bunch of Blood Surges, go into Blood Mist, gain this 40% multiplier, cap out my resource, and then when I come out, I'm ready to burst again. And you can just keep repeating that because as you're overpowering, you're reducing the cooldown of Blood Mist. So Tybalt's Will is actually a very good option if you don't want to be using Blood Moon Breaches, or if you find yourself frequently low on essence. Another option that I run pretty frequently is just a pair of rare pants with defensive stats. So I have percent armor, maximum life, damage reduction, and damage reduction from close. These are also the best pants I've ever found in game. I was extremely shocked when I found these. And I run the Embalmer aspect on this, where consuming a corpse has a 30% chance to spawn a blood orb. And that is mostly for our Rathma's Vigor key passive, where every, I believe, 8,000 healing from blood orbs, we reduce the cooldown on Rathma's Vigor by 2 seconds. So this is just going to help speed that up. And it's also just a little bit of extra healing to help keep us alive. So those are 2 other options for pants. For boots, there's a lot of options. You definitely want attack speed. I recommend for survivability using dodge chance and damage reduction while injured. And for general farming, I like to have movement speed after killing elites, because especially since we're using Banished Lord's Talisman, which is an amulet that doesn't have attack movement speed, we're going to be generally pretty slow. So having that role really helps speed up farming. Other options on boots are things like all stats, intelligence, essence cost reduction, which again is pretty valuable if you find yourself frequently low on essence. Although I will mention something about that later on when I'm talking about Banished Lord's Talisman. And you can also use a different aspect. I like this one because it's active all the time. When I'm running through town, when I'm running from pack to pack in dungeons, although, if I take damage, I lose it, but it's only for 2.5 seconds. So this is really just a 20% increase to movement speed throughout most of my playtime, which makes up for the loss that I have from using Banished Lord's Talisman. But you can pretty much use any aspect that you like for movement speed on boots, or you could potentially run something like Exploiters, which is a 40% multiplier against enemies that are unstoppable. You could also use Flicker Step if you find yourself wanting to reset Bone Storm more often. So really you can do a lot of things with the boot slot. So looking now at Banished Lord's Talisman, this is really just the best option for necklace. However, you could potentially use a rare necklace with movement speed, percent armor, essence cost reduction, and Tides of Blood passive. That's something that I bounce back and forth between this and Banished Lord's Talisman often, just because I like having movement speed on an amulet. But what I was going to mention about essence cost reduction is it's actually better to not have essence cost reduction on gear if possible, because we want to try to make use of the unique effect from the Banished Lord's Talisman, which states after you spend 300 primary resource, your next core skill is guaranteed to overpower. So we do want to be using more essence, and that is potentially one reason that I've considered going back to using Imperfectly Balanced on the skill tree. However, the added cost of Imperfectly Balanced does really just kind of feel bad to play with. So I typically go for other options on the skill tree and just try to avoid essence cost reduction on gear when I'm using this amulet. But that's why if you were to use a rare amulet with a different aspect on it, I would recommend having essence cost reduction, as that's going to allow you to get out more blood surges, and you're going to be able to overpower more frequently due to the cycling of effect of blood surge, where every 5 you overpower. So moving on to Starless Skies. Now, everything I just said does kind of conflict with using Starless Skies, as it's going to reduce the cost of blood surge every time we cast by up to 40%. However, it's also going to give us a 40% multiplier, which really is the best multiplier that we have available left for a slot. So Starless Skies Ring is really the best choice here, in my opinion. And in addition to that, we also get 12% resistance to all elements in the in the primary stats on the ring. So that's going to allow us to reach that 70% resistance cap that I was talking about earlier. We're using Sacrilegious Ring, and the reason for this is really just for the corpse explosion every 1 second. So you want to try to get the lowest number possible in the unique affix, and that really is the most important roll on this piece of gear, is having a 1 second roll. And that's to allow us to consume corpses to activate our Fueled by Death on the skill tree, as well as our Flesh Eater legendary node. This is how we enable that without having to waste time casting those abilities ourselves. And the substats are pretty good. 3 ranks to corpse skills, sort of irrelevant, but you can cast corpse tendrils more frequently at least. Maximum essence is okay. Maximum life is good. And lucky hit chance we talked about before. Bloodless Wall is what I like to run using this build, as Blood Surge hits everything on the screen. So you'll see frequently when you have Bone Storm active, you'll cast Blood Surge and a Bone Storm will appear, 3 of them in different places all over the screen, and that's really just going to help keep our Bone Storms active all the time. So we're generating barrier from Shielding Storm, we have the increased damage reduction, we have the increased critical strike chance. This is really what helps us achieve that. And then for our last gear slot, our weapon, I go for a wand as it has a very fast attack speed, and the 15% lucky hit chance is nice. I wouldn't really recommend going for a sword, as that's going to give you 17.5% critical strike damage, which is just additive. I think it might go up when you upgrade it. I can't remember if that's the base or the upgraded number, but again, it's really just additive damage, which doesn't matter too much. Another option here, though, would be a scythe, if you like the life on kill. I personally just go for the wand. Scythe is going to have a slower attack speed. It is going to hit a little bit harder, but again, I generally like the faster hits, more attack speed, more chances for our abilities to overpower. And then for substats, we go for all stats, intelligence, as these are going to directly contribute to our skill damage. And then we really don't have many other choices. Everything else is just going to be an additive damage. So I go for critical strike damage and overpower damage. Other options here would be damage to close, core skill damage. Those are all fine. It's just that critical strike damage and overpower damage are going to be active basically all the time. If I were to go for something like vulnerable damage here, well, again, I'm really only getting vulnerable damage consistently when I'm fighting single target, and that's because my only source of vulnerable is going to be from the Seneschal construct using Tempest, which is a single target ability. So fighting bosses, they'll be vulnerable all the time, but when going through dungeons, really not making most enemies that I'm fighting vulnerable. And then the aspect that I use is Wrath Most Chosen, and that's because it gives us a 50% attack speed bonus when our abilities overpower, and that's just very valuable to have in general. There are other options here. You could go for the aspect that makes Blood Surge echo, the Nova echo, and hit a second time. That's an option. You could also go for Untimely Death, which gives you an overpowered damage bonus based on the amount that you heal in between overpowering attacks. These are some other choices. Really, it's up to you. You could even potentially use Black River in this build, and that's something that I have done in the past, but I really just like this version of it with Wrath Most Chosen. And that's going to be it for the video guide to my Blood Surge build. I hope you enjoyed, and please let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you.